Welcome back. In this demonstration, we will go over the group policy management. Before we look at the group policy management, let's look at the Active Directory users and computers. On my previous video, we have built a domain called sanuja.local, and underneath that domain, we have created organizational units in Active Directory users and computers under Net IT Geeks. And in there, we have created the content creation group and social media group. Now I have also added few other organizational units such as accounting, human resources, and IT. And I have added few users to each of these groups for demonstration purposes. So when you want to add an organizational unit or users to your domain, you do that using the Active Directory users and computers console. Now, whatever you do in here, get link or attach to your Microsoft Group Policy Management console as well. What I mean by that is, let's go and look at the server manager, go to tools and open Group Policy Management console. Now I'll close this one, and if I put these two side by side, the Active Directory users and computers and Group Policy Management console, and I expand the Group Policy Management console tree on the left hand side, so we have sanuja.local, just like on Active Directory users and computers, sanuja.local, which is the domain. And if I expand that, we have the domain and sites. And under the domain, if I expand the domain, we have the sanuja.local, which is the domain we have. And then when you expand that option, you see the default domain policy, which comes with your Active Directory. Every single time you create a domain controller on your Windows server, you will have that domain and the default domain policy. And you see the domain controller right here. And under there, we also see the default domain controller policy. And then you see the Net IT Geeks organizational unit, which is the same unit, remember, we created on my previous videos under the Active Directory users and computers. And underneath the Net IT Geeks, if I expand it, you see every single organizational unit I have created under Active Directory users and computers shows up on the Group Policy Management console. We have accounting, content creation, human resources, IT, and social media, just like we have organizational units we see here on the Active Directory users and computers. And you can expand it and see if there are any policies that are attached there, but currently there are no policies attached, so that's why there's nothing showing up on any of these items. But you can see this reflects whatever the changes we have made on the Active Directory users and computers. The reason why this is because when you want to apply a group policy or group policy object to your users and computers, the smallest unit which you can apply those policies are the organizational units, also known as OUs. So the domain controllers is a OU, the Net IT Geek is another OU, and underneath Net IT Geeks we have accounting, content creation, HR, IT, social media. All of these items are organizational units which we have created in the Active Directory users and computers console over here. So in here, we actually went in there and we created these OUs. And now we can use those OUs in the Group Policy Management console to apply policies accordingly. So before we go into that, I will show you how the group policies are created. So in here, if you keep going down this list, you will see something called Group Policy Objects. So right here, there is a folder called Group Policy Objects. If I click on it, it'll have two default policies, or you can expand right like that, and you'll see two default policies. These two default policies are default domain controllers policy and default domain policy. Every single time you create a Microsoft domain, you will end up with these two policies. This is where you create all your policies, or you will have all your typical group policy objects in your domain controller. So for example, right here we have the default domain controller policy, and it is attached or linked to the domain controller organizational unit. So the policy is created down here, and then it get attached to the domain controllers. And then here we have the default domain policy, and it is being attached. It has been attached to the sanuja.local domain. So you can see that attachment right here. See this small arrow? So what that basically means is whatever the rules that we have within default domain controller policy is now attached and impacting anything underneath domain controller organizational unit, and anything that have been attached to the default domain policy has been attached to the domain controller organizational units and anything underneath it. These policies and all of these rules are saved in the SYSVOL folder. On my previous videos and lectures, I have explained how fundamentals of Active Directory and GPOs work, and I explained there is a folder called SYSVOL. So let's go ahead and look at this SYSVOL folder, because that is where these domain policies are being saved. So if I go into my file explorer, and if I go to my server, which is / your server name, so in my case it's SSServe 2022, and if I go to my SYSVOL folder, I have my domain called sanuja.local, and when I click on it, I have an option here, the folder here called policies. So if I click on policies, I see two policies, one ending with 84F9, the other one ending with 984F9. So one is ending with 84 F9, like this, a slightly different name. Actually, let's look at the front, because these are last few numbers are the same. 6AC17. This one is 31B2 F3. You can look at it as a bunch of random numbers and letters, but these have meanings because these are attached to your policies over here. These two represents these two policies. If you want to know which policy is attached to which one, what we can do, we can go under the group policy objects, and you can right click on the policy and click edit, and it will open the group policy management editor. And in here, we can go into the policy, select the policy, right click and click properties. And in here, you will see a unique name, and this unique name will be the same name as the folder here under the SYSVOL local domain in this situation that you have here. So here, for example, this folder is 6AC1786C. So 6AC1786C is basically the default domain controller policy, because this is how the Windows server knows what this policy is and where this is located. The human readable format here is the default domain controller policy, but the machine is reading these random numbers and characters that we have here. If you go inside this folder, you can see there are a few things in here, such as the machine folder, and then we have the users folder. And as a system administrator, typically you don't edit anything in here. You don't go here and edit anything in here. Instead, what we do, actually, we do all of those things using the Active Directory users and computers console and the group policy editors consoles. We don't actually go into these folders manually and edit anything. But if you look at, for example, users folder and go to scripts, you can see that the log off and log on scripts, remember, which I explained to you on my previous video, that you see with these users. So if I go to properties on the Active Directory users and computers, and if I go to profile, the logon script, for example, you can have a couple of ways of attaching it. So if I attach it using here, it will not show up here. But if I attach it using the group policy management, or group policy, it will show up in here. So for example, for like a logon script, instead of doing it on the profile, instead of going into properties and attaching in the profile, if I attach it using the group policy management editor, it will show up in here with the respective group policy object. So now you know where it is getting saved, and on my previous videos I discussed what SYSVOL is, and this is what one of the examples of how we use that SYSVOL folder in Microsoft Domain Controller. So let's go out of the group policy management editor here, and I'm going to briefly show you how you can create a new group policy object. So I'm going to create a group policy object that will be attached to our, let's say, our IT department. Okay, so I'm going to attach to this IT department a specific group policy object. So I'm going to select that IT department on the group policy management. So I'll make this thing bigger because that's what we're just going to look at the group policy management console now. And then I'm going to say create a group policy object in this domain and link it here. So you can create it and link it at the same time by doing this. The other option you have is you can simply go to group policy object here, right click and click new. So if I do this, what's going to happen is I will create a new group policy, but it's not going to be get linked to anything in here. But if you want to link it right away, what you can do, actually you can right click on the IT organizational unit, and we can say create a GPO in this domain and link it here. And let's say I'm going to call this the IT default policy. So I'm going to say this is IT default policy. You can name it whatever the way you like, and you can actually create it from a original currently existing GPO, or you can just select it as a brand new one. So in this case I'm going to say brand new one. I'm going to click OK. Notice that when I created that group policy called IT default policy, not only appears under the IT section, the IT GPO, it also appeared under the group policy objects here, because this is where the default policies are. And all of your policies that you create attached to any of your organizational units here will appear here as a result. You can also, as I mentioned, create a policy here. Let's say we will call this a, so let's see what we call this one. So this one we call IT default policy. So let's create a new one. I'm going to call this the HR default policy. And I'm going to create a new policy right here. But now if I go to the HR, that's not attached to this HR default policy. To attach this HR default policy to the HR organizational unit, you can select that organizational unit, right click and select link an existing GPO. And then from here, we can see the policies that we have created and listed under the group policy objects. So what we are trying to do is attach HR organizational unit to the HR default policy. So I'm going to select that one, and you have the ability to select multiple policies at one go by holding onto your CTRL button on your keyboard, and you can select it whatever you want to select like that. But in this case, I'm just going to attach one policy called the HR default policy, and I can click OK. And now the HR default policy from down here is attached to up here. So you have two ways of creating group policy. I just showed you by just selecting your group policy, selecting your organizational unit and creating a GPO that is automatically going to attach here, or creating a group policy right here by clicking new here, right click on the group policy objects and new here, and then attaching it later here by right clicking here and link an existing GPO. So you have two ways of creating it. Finally, I'm going to briefly go over what you can see or what you can do with the default group policies or group policies that you will be creating under group policy objects. So let's pick the new group policy that we created called the HR default policy, and I'm going to right click and click edit. which open up the group policy management editor, which we saw previously a few minutes ago. Now in here, we see the HR policy name. So GP name in here is the HR default policy, because that's what I name it. You can name it whatever you like. You can call it HR policy or a HR main policy or whatever you like to call it. And underneath there, we have computer configurations and we have user configurations. Under computer configurations, we have policies and we have preferences. Under user configurations, we have policies and preferences. So basically, this is, you can look at this as like nodes or like containers within the group policy management editor, where you can apply specific policies or preferences to your computers and users. So any user currently in HR organizational unit, because this policy is attached to the HR organizational unit, going to have an impact on any changes that you're going to make here. Policies under group policy management editor, for example, can impact the software settings, Windows settings, and you can use some of the templates available to you to define those things underneath here. The preferences can also impact how the computer behave as you delegate or control that type of configurations. Under user configurations, again, we have the policies and preferences, and it has a similar way of controlling it. An example of a policy, for example, I can say that the user do not have the ability to change the background image. So they can change the background image of a Windows 11 or a Windows 10 machine. I can enforce that policy through the computer configuration policies. So that's how you can actually enforce policies through the group policy management editor. Keep in mind that, as you can see, if you don't attach this group policy to a specific organizational unit, whatever the changes you make here will not have any impact on any users or computers or devices on your domain. So when you're first creating your first group policy, for example, I recommend that you create it here, down here, select all the options that you need to select and configure them. Then you can attach to the organizational unit. But it doesn't really matter. You can attach it first and edit it. It doesn't really matter. But I prefer that when you're first starting out, just make the changes here first and then you can attach it later. So you have that option to do that. I will go into depth of what these are and some of the examples associated with this in my future videos. For now, just know these items exist. Next thing I'm going to show you is how you can remove a policy that is attached to a group. Like for example, right now, a organizational unit, human resources, sorry, it's not a group actually, it's a human resources organizational unit, have the HR default policy attached. But let's say I want to remove this policy. I want to unlink it. What you can do, you can select that policy under the organizational unit, right click, and then you can remove it by saying link enable to link disable. What that basically going to do is this group policy is now not impacting users in human resources. So it's unlinked. You can link enable as well. And if you right click again, you can actually click here saying delete. If I click delete here, it's going to give you a warning saying, do you want to delete this link? So in other words, we are deleting or removing the group policy object from the human resources organizational unit, but not deleting from the entire server. So it's not deleting from down here. It's only going to delete it from the link status up here. So you have two options. You can either disable the link, so it's temporarily disabling it, or you can simply right click and delete. And if I click here OK, what happened is that group policy object is gone from the organizational unit HR, but you still have it down here. If you want to completely remove a group policy, you can right click in here and you can say delete. and this will completely remove that policy and anything linked to it from your group policy management. So if I click yes, it's completely gone from there. And that's everything for today. If you have questions or concerns, please reach out to me. Please make sure to thumbs up this video and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, have a nice day.